Sal Solo, welcome to Campus 103.7. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be back in Malta again.
After 41 years.
Indeed, but we still remember it.
So we'll talk about that in a few minutes, if that's okay. Where are you at the moment?
I live in Florida. You can see, a little bit of the beautiful Florida sunshine behind me, I'm sure.
Indeed, the United States. And you've been living there for quite a long time.
I've been in the States 24 years, something like that, and I've been in Florida nearly 9 years now.
And I believe you teach singing, and you are in charge of a big church choir, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I've been giving some guitar lessons to kids lately, teenagers, and so that's kind of funny going back,
But you've released albums of Christian music over the years under your own name.
At least, yes, I think since 1985, I was releasing albums in my own name, and then I stopped probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or a bit less. So I thought I was retired from music, but here I am back again.
Indeed, and so much the better for it. We're really looking forward to the new Classics Nouveau album. The fourth Classics Nouveau album, and the first in 40 years.
Indeed, yes, that's right.
It's going to be called Battle Cry, and it's being issued by Cherry Records in the UK.
Cherry Red.
Okay.
Cherry Red, yeah.
The last Classics Nouveau album was Secret in 1983.
Correct, yes.
And
almost to the day.
Almost, yes. So what happened? How come 40 years later, Sal Solo and the rest of the original band, and maybe we can give them a mention and say hi to them, how come you came back together? What happened to bring you back together and decide to release a new album?
Well, it's most unexpected, and I guess it's really a cultural thing in humanity. Like, we never imagined when people got old, they wouldn't get old. And so one of my friends in the music biz the other day was saying to me, our parents seem very old at 60, but now we're there, we don't seem to be any different. And so I guess we never really anticipated that when our fans got old, they would still be demanding the music. For instance, it was, I think, 1981, the first time we went to America. We were appearing in New York, and our agent said that night he had tickets for the Rolling Stones, and he wanted to see if they could still rock at 40.
40.
Yeah. So we were 20-something, they were 40-something, and nobody had really seen a rock band in their 40s before. Nobody had thought about it.
There was the whole punk ethos as well, die before I get old sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, that's the Who, isn't it? That's before punk.
Even so, absolutely, yeah. Live fast, die young.
When we were all young, I put out a video the other day saying, remember when we thought 30 was old, and then we passed 30 and 40 and 50, and we didn't give up our love of music. And so that was really a whole phenomenon that we just never anticipated. We never would have imagined back in the day that people would be still wanting to hear our music when we were old. So I think, as far as I can tell, around about 2008, somebody from Switzerland made a fan page on Facebook. We didn't know anything about it. We were not, to be honest, really thinking Classics Nouveau these past decades. And gradually, I guess it built up, and then it came to our attention 4 or 5 years ago, and we were amazed.
But you had kept in touch, of course.
Not so much. I mean, maybe once in a blue moon. But suddenly people were posting every day, or photos, tickets, gig posters, dates. They know stuff we don't know. The anniversary when this record was released, and so on. So we started to be kind of impressed. And so probably a couple of years ago now, I said to the guys, why don't we record a song together again as a kind of birthday present for these people when on the anniversary of one of our releases. And so we did that. but we thought that would be just a one-off and that would be it. And right away they're saying, new material, we want new material.
And
So
the song you recorded was a remix of one of the classic songs, right?
it was a remake of one of our originals, yeah. And so we were completely freaked out with the notion of writing new material for a Classics Nouveau in the 2000s. And probably for about 6 weeks, I was going around thinking, how could we possibly do that? You know, we can't be new romantics all over again, and we can't put our mindset back into how we were when we were young any more than you can fit into your old clothes from 40 years ago, you know?
Tell me about it.
Then one day it suddenly struck me, we don't have to be the band of 40 years ago. What if we were Classics Nouveau today? What would we want to sound like? What kind of music would we be? What kind of songs would we want to write? And then suddenly the inspiration came, and so there's a whole new Classics.
And the record company was interested, and there was a whole flurry of excitement.
Well, yes, probably more than we expected, because a year ago we put out one of the first songs that we finished as a single, and it was so universally greeted with enthusiasm. We were really surprised. It was like, wow, is it really that good?
In fact, it's called Fix Your Eyes Up.
Fix Your
correct?
Eyes Up, yes, that's right.
And it's an interesting point. I wanted to point this out to you and see what you'd say. Fix Your Eyes Up is a very positive song. It talks about how there's still so much to achieve, even in your 50s and 60s, if necessary. So fix your eyes up on the prize, things to look forward to, which is almost the complete opposite of that remake song you made of the one you mentioned the one you did a couple of years ago, where the lyrics are inside outside. There are very few things to look forward to for you or for me. Now, of course, that was you speaking in your teenage or 20s years, so maybe the late 70s and early 80s were problematic or something, but there's so much positivity in Fix Your Eyes Up, as opposed to the other song, Inside Outside.
Well, I don't think so much that the 80s were necessarily a bad time, as that when you're young, you don't necessarily know what's to look forward to. And now that we're older, we appreciate things a lot more, don't we? We appreciate life. I'm not personally married, but I know a lot of people my age have children and grandchildren and things to be proud of. And we're interested in things that we just never were when we were young. You know, I like history. I take an interest in politics and world affairs, and even, you know, the history of my country, both my countries really. And I never would have done that back in my 20s. You know, we were concerned with other things. And so we're speaking very much to our audience. You know, we've grown up, they've grown up. And so as people now more mature, we look at life a different way. And we do, I think, look at all the things that are yet to be done, all the things that we have to look forward to. And so that is very much the theme of the album. We know who we're speaking to. And so it's almost like meeting an old friend again after so many years, and like all the things that you want to share because of your life's experience.
So the album's called Battle Cry. It's the fourth Classics Nouveau album, 40 years after the last one. It features the drummer B.P. Herding and Mick Sweeney.
Gary Steadman, they're the same people as were on Night People and La Verite, and so people will recognize them.
But there were some other members of the band over the years. There was a Finnish guitarist at one point. I'm not sure. Yeah. I was too young to come to your concert in Malta in 1982. I was 9. I only found out it had happened 10 years later. But I'm not sure which lineup had come to Malta.
Well, at the time of our third album, you're right, we did have Jimmy Suman from Finland, and I believe that was when we came to Malta. But for the majority of the life of Classics Nouveau, it was the exact same lineup we have today.
So, hello to the other three boys in the band. Battle Cry, people can order it now, and it's going to be the fourth Classics Nouveau album. We're really looking forward to it. But let's go back to the beginning and tell us about the history of the band, perhaps even how you started off in the music industry. I mean, it was a very exciting time. The 70s, there was a lot of different kinds of amazing music that still resonates today.
Well, it was really the time of punk, and I had a band that was signed to a record label, GTO Records, that used to have Donna Summer and others. Actually, the guy that ran the label, he had discovered the Bay City Rollers.
Oh,
And
oh
I was
wow.
wondering, when you're saying you're so young, whether you actually knew who they were.
Well, I'm interested in music and history, like you are. So I've read a
Yes.
lot about. I know that weren't the Bay City Rollers the ones who dressed in tartan?
Yeah, they were kind of like one of the first, what we today we call boy
Boy
bands, really,
bands.
you know,
Yes, yes.
for all the girls to scream at them. And anyway, so I was signed up to this label and recorded a few songs. And one day, the boss of the label, when he was at the studio, he said, "You haven't given up your day jobs, have you?" I was shocked. I thought, we've made it. You know, we're in a big professional recording studio. We've got all this equipment they paid for and everything. Now he's telling us, but he was right, because within a few months we were back on the dole,
Oh.
and I was kind of like, I've had it with bands. I'm gonna just go and join somebody else's band.
You
And
were called the News, I believe, that original band, yes?
yes, my band was called The News, and I looked around. We used to have a newspaper in England at that time called Melody Maker that had pages and pages of classified ads, and that was where everybody found their musicians for their bands. So at that time, it was right at the end of the 70s, and I found two bands that I'd heard of before. They were both punk bands, and so I went to the first one, and I think they might have had one or two hits, but I knew the guitarist was the original guitarist of the Police, and I knew him. Henry, his name was. He was French.
Padovani, Henry Padovani, I
Yes.
believe.
And so, funnily enough, I knew him. I don't really remember what the band was called, but my next audition was X-Ray Specs, and
Famous punk band.
yeah, and Polystyrene had left, and they were in a state of disarray because she wrote all the songs and everything. So they were looking for a new leader and songwriter, and it turned out that two of them liked somebody else and two of them liked me. And so that night, BP, the drummer, he said to me, "I want to form a band with you." And I was thinking, oh no, I don't want to go through all that forming a band stuff again. But then the guitarist also wanted to do it, and so I called up the bass player from the News, who was Mick Sweeney, and there we were. Our first gig, Classix Nouveaux, said X-Ray Specs,
Now,
Classix Nouveau.
yes. Now, the story of where Spandau Ballet came up with their name is quite legendary, and it's quite an arty name. Classics Nouveau is quite up there as well when it comes to art. Where did you come up with that name?
Well, I think first of all, you mentioned before, it was an exciting time because things were new. Things were still new in the 70s and 80s. After that, it kind of seems like things got kind of stagnated and predictable. But we were always kind of wanting to be the next wave of something. And so when we had our first gig coming up, it was because of the X-Ray Specs connection. It was very easy to get booked and all that. And we even had record companies at our first gig. But we figured we'd have to have a name, and so we were sitting around passing around a pad and everybody putting ideas, and the only one that seemed to, apart from all the obscene ones, the only one that really seemed to have any traction, it was like the Classics, because at the time ska had come in, and so bands were called The Beat and The Selector and things like that, and I thought that was just a bit too ordinary. And I always liked French, so the Classics became Classics Nouveau.
Oh,
And it had a little meaning, because obviously Classics kind of means old or traditional, and Nouveau means new. And so there was always an idea to sort of take something in the past and create something new. But to be honest, I don't think we ever achieved that until today. With our new album, we finally got there.
Great story. Okay, so you started gigging around London. Exciting time. I've seen tickets with or posters with your band's name on there, and Adam and the Ants, and some of these bands that later on became legendary. Unfortunately, you didn't have that much success in the UK yourselves, but you did have in many other countries. But that period is quite an exciting time. Did you meet some of these other people who eventually became stars? Adam Ant, Boy George. I don't know. Did you go to the Blitz Club, for example? Did you hang out with all these eventual stars?
Yeah, yeah.
Not that you're not a star, but
I'm not a star. Don't do it. No. But yeah, we. Oh yeah, certainly we played with, as you say, Adam the Ants, XTC, even Gary Glitter, Ultravox quite often. And actually, our manager was managing Adam the Ants, and so his first #1 record was because of our manager.
Falcon Stewart, I believe.
Falcon Stewart, yeah, who managed X-Ray Specs before. He also went on to manage a girl group called Amazulu, who had a hit or two.
Oh yeah,
And,
too good to be forgotten. I think one of them was. Sorry, I've got this photographic memory of 80s music when I was a child. I was obsessed.
yeah. The clubs at the time, the whole what came to be called New Romantic was just starting, and so those were the places that we went to. So I knew George, I knew Marilyn, I knew the people that would become Hazy Fantasy, and even as you mentioned, the Spandau guys occasionally might hang out there, or Midjure or somebody like that. There was even a night when Bowie came to the Blitz, and they were all real excited about that. But George was not allowed to engage with him because George was the cloakroom attendant. And another funny thing about George is that, well, actually, I've got lots of stories about him, but there was one time we were playing at the Lyceum before Gary Glitter, and George was a huge fan of Gary Glitter. It also happens that George comes from an Irish background, and our bass player, Mick Sweeney, came from an Irish background. So they were sitting around in our dressing room singing Irish songs, and then George kept saying, will you come with me and knock on Gary Glitter's dressing room? I don't know if he wanted an autograph or something. But George was supposed to appear in our first video for Guilty.
Oh, wow.
Because it was going to kind of show the whole New Romantic fashions and so on the first time. So all the people who appeared in it were people that came to our gigs, and they appeared in the video the way they were dressed up with the crazy hair and makeup, whatever.
And the costumes.
So George was supposed to be there, and what happened was we had to start filming early in the morning, about 8 o'clock. And so come midday or 1 o'clock, they said, there's somebody on the phone for you. So I go pick up the phone, it's George. He says, I'm ready now, shall I come down? I said, well, you're too late. We've missed it, you missed it now. And so probably about a year or two later than that, so there was Culture Club, the biggest thing going. So that probably would have been his first music video appearance if he'd have made it.
Absolutely. Other people you might have met at the time and hung out with, I don't know, Gary Numan or...
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I don't know if you're aware of what Top of the Pops used to be.
Yeah. It's the program that broke a lot of bands over the years, isn't it?
Pretty much everyone. So the very first time that I was at Top of the Pops, it was Gary Numan was there.
Oh.
And so obviously he was like the biggest thing going at that time. We're talking, I guess, around about 79 or something.
With the electronic music.
Yeah. And I just remember thinking he looks very short, and he looks kind of shy and timid, really, the opposite to the way that he would look on stage. Obviously, there was a lot of other people that we were around at that time. The two brothers from Japan were at our first gig.
Oh.
They went to school with our original guitarist, Jack Airport. Phil Lynott was around one time. I can't quite remember why, but I remember him. The bass player of Yes, Chris Squire, came to one of our parties one time, one of our launch parties or something. Don't know why. I guess some people, they just go to rock and roll parties.
I read this book by Simon Reynolds about the British music industry, which focuses on that period, sort of the mid 70s to the mid 80s, and he didn't hesitate to call it, if not as influential, almost as influential as the 60s explosion of British bands when it comes down to creativity and the amazing quality and style and different types of music that British bands and singers were coming up with at the time. Amazing.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because in the 60s, obviously I'm not quite old enough to have been part of that, but my perception is that because everything was so new, it was kind of people didn't quite know what the influence that music and fashion together were going to have. But by the 70s into the 80s, then it was very well established. Youth culture ruled. I'm thinking there probably wasn't youth culture before that in the 60s and 50s. But once youth culture came along, whatever teenagers were into was going to affect everybody. And so it was all over TV, obviously it was all over the radio, magazines, everywhere. And so people were constantly wanting to hear about what's the new thing? I remember the first time I heard the phrase New Romantics. I think it was in one of the music papers, maybe Sounds, and it was a letter from somebody saying there's this new movement in music in London, New Romantics. It involves Ultravox Japan and Classix Nouveaux.
Oh.
And we didn't know we were part of a movement at that point, but there you go. And then shortly after that, we had to go and play in Birmingham for the first time. I don't know if you've ever been to Birmingham.
No.
But people call it Spaghetti Junction. There's all these overpasses built everywhere. So if you're not from Birmingham, bear in mind back in those days we didn't have MapQuest or iPhones, so we couldn't find the club, and so we saw a guy walking down the street wearing leather pants, and we thought, oh, maybe he knows. So we asked him, do you know where the Cedar Ballroom is? And he said, yeah, I'm going there. So all right, jump in. So we got there, and when we got there, it said Classics Nouveau with Duran Duran. And he was the drummer
of Duran Duran.
Yes.
Oh wow! So they supported you.
Yes.
Amazing.
And then shortly after that, they got signed to EMI, saying we were on EMI. So we used to see them quite often.
Mm-hmm.
When we were playing in Birmingham one time after that, I remember Gary, our guitarist, was pally with Andy, the guitarist of Duran, and he invited him to come on and play with us for our final number.
Oh wow!
And I remember another time we were playing in Newcastle City Hall, and they just happened to be there, so they just showed up at our gig. And so yeah, it was quite common those days that we would all be kind of around each other.
That's amazing. Great stories. Thank you, Sal. That's amazing stuff. I'm sure there's a big group of people in Malta who appreciate that music from that era. And hearing these stories, I'm sure they will really appreciate and enjoy hearing them. So Guilty was your first sort of big single, but there's a story about an unfortunate incident that resulted in you not actually having a hit with it in the UK. But then it turned out to be a hit in the States, at least on MTV. Could you tell us about that?
Well, we spoke earlier about Top of the Pops, and the way the things used to kind of work is your record might enter the charts at number 80 or something, or number 60 or something, and then climb up over a couple of weeks, and by the time it got into the top 50, usually they'd invite you onto Top of the Pops, and next thing, the record would, as you say, be a hit. And so at that time, we were going along nicely, and we'd reached about number 45 or 43 or something. And then the BBC electricians went on strike for 6 weeks.
Oh.
So there was no Top of the Pops, so we didn't get the extra boost that we needed. But a year later, we got an interesting opportunity when there used to be a Saturday night show. It was kind of like, if you've heard of it, the States used to have Saturday Night Live. And so for a period of time, there was a similar show in England with Chris Tarrant and Lenny Henry, and they used to have comedy, what we call in the States comedy skits and things, I guess, live audience, and they would have a band. But they insisted that the band had to be live. And at that time, most bands didn't play live on TV. It wasn't that they didn't want to, it was just that union regulations, whatever, prevented it. So Top the Pops was always miming, or what they call it these days. They have a word for it, don't they? Playback, is that what they call it?
Yeah.
Lip sync. Lip sync, that's the word I'm looking for. So, yeah, we had to normally lip sync. So this particular week, the band from the 70s, Slade, was supposed to appear, but apparently Noddy said he didn't want to sing live. And so I said, I'll sing live. And so we went on, I sang live, and next week it's in the top 40. And so we missed out the first time, but we hit the second time.
And now you're talking about Is It a Dream?
Is it a Dream? That's right.
That's
yes.
right. So Is It a Dream was your big top 20 hit in the UK.
Yeah.
And also here in Malta. That's the one that gets played at 80s parties. Is It a Dream? Guilty, however, gets shown on MTV to this very day. Even the classic MTV channels still show Guilty. And you had no idea that it was being shown on this brand new channel that opened in 1981 in the States called MTV. And that you got some American fans thanks to that video. Is that correct?
Oh, totally, yeah. Well, it was a very good video of its time. Because the director, Russell Mulcahy, he went on to make movies. I think he might have done some Mad Max movies, and he had a long-running series on MTV in more recent years, Teen Wolf. And a very, very good director. He did the Ultravox video for Vienna.
Very moody and...
Yeah, that was what really sold us on it. But also, as I mentioned before, it kind of showed the new romantics for the first time, the way that people dressed at the clubs, and they had these sort of jerky moves in their dances and whatever. It's kind of culturally interesting. And when MTV started, a station that's going to just play videos all day was what it originally was. And so any good video that came from England was in rotation. And so there's a lot of things around the world that we didn't know about, because we take things for granted these days. We live on the internet, so we know everything that's going on everywhere. But back then we didn't. You know, one time we arrived in Israel for a tour, and I was holding a press conference, and they said, "How does it feel to be number one in Israel?" I said, "I didn't know I was number one in Israel." So it doesn't feel anything.
Yeah. The funny thing about Guilty as well is that the director was asked to direct another song around shortly after he directed Guilty, and it's that famous that Betty Davis Eyes song by
right, yes.
And the videos look very similar, funnily enough. But yours came first.
Well, Russell is Australian, but he was living in London, and so when they saw Guilty in New York, they flew him over there and they said, "We want a video like that for Kim Carnes' Betty Davis Eyes."
Yeah.
And they, of course, didn't have New Romantics in New York at that time, so they probably had actors to dress up and try and copy, the moves or whatever. So the only real difference is in Guilty, you see a lot of curtains kind of blowing around in the breeze, and in the Kim Carnes one, you don't. But other than that, it's very similar. Anyway, she got the number one, we didn't. And also BP ended up writing a song for her album after that as well. That's one of his proud achievements.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. That's fantastic.
There you go.
Right, so Classics Nouveau, we established you had a big hit in the UK in '82 with Is It a Dream? And you were a hit in America, a smaller hit, but still, nevertheless, you got some American fans thanks to MTV. And then you had the whole touring thing. You started touring. Let's get the Malta out of the way first, and your visit to Malta. And then maybe we can talk a bit about your other experiences in other countries. Because you were massive in Poland, in Yugoslavia, many other countries. One of those bands that somehow isn't big in their own country, but then makes it big in other countries. There have been a few over the years. But do you remember how your trip to Malta came about?
Well, that was probably 1983, I'm thinking.
I believe it
And
was 82
oh,
to be
82.
82, and it was a concert in a place called Tinier, which is now one big hotel. It's been built up, but it was in an old fortress, which dates like 400 or 500 years, built by the Knights of St. John, and then the British forces added to it during the time of the British Empire. But once the British forces had left Malta in the 70s and we got our independence, that fortress was turned over to bands. They had their garages to practice in, and that whole community had this sort of was given money by the government to organize a youth festival. So there were some Maltese bands playing, and then they had enough money to bring over a band from abroad, and your band was the one chosen, as far as I can make out.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that, as I mentioned, we were with EMI, and so EMI had pretty much all the biggest bands in the world. They had Queen, they had U2, they had Pink Floyd, and so they had the reach. They were in every country. Secondly, our manager, Falcon, he was not like a typical business kind. He was like a sort of well, he was an artist really, because his father was the sculptor to the Queen.
Oh,
and he has lots of famous Winston Churchill statues around London and other cities of the world. And his mother was a poet. His sister is called Electra, just to give you an idea. And so he just found it very fascinating, the idea that with a rock and roll band, you could just go around the world. I mean, I think a little bit later on, the police were like this. You know, they found it fascinating to go to India and Arab countries and whatever. And so we didn't really focus so much on England or America as other bands did, because we were not really particularly interested in making a fortune or something. If we'd been going for the biggest business venture, then we probably would have focused on the States. But we just found it so fascinating to go to places where people typically don't go. And so we did go to India, as you said. We went to Poland. We were probably the first Western band into Poland, I think, or maybe the second. They told me there was a heavy metal band called Budgie that was in before us. And yeah, I mean, so many places.
Yugoslavia and Scandinavia, Portugal,
Yeah.
South America.
Our first silver disc was actually in well, it was called Yugoslavia then. Obviously, Iceland. I think we were number one in Iceland, and today is really interesting because our fans who post online, they're posting from places like Estonia, Uruguay, you know, places that I barely even know where they are, and that's so very interesting.
It is. So, your memories of Malta, you only spent a couple of days here, or maybe even one day, probably.
Well, the place, probably more than one day. The place that you were talking about, the fort, isn't it by the sea?
Yes, that's right, yes, opposite the capital city, Valletta.
I seem to remember it being a very beautiful setting, and all of the sea as a backscape. And there was one not so good thing, and that is I remember it was very smelly. I don't know if Malta still is, but we're talking obviously that many years ago. But they seem to be having some problem with the water. They told me that I guess they would get seawater and try and refine it to make it purified.
There was a water purifying plant built around that area, possibly being built at that time.
Oh, that must have been it then. Like it really smelled bad.
Oh dear. Okay.
But other than that, you know, the fans were really very, very nice. The food was good, and so we enjoyed our visit.
Did you get to see other parts of Malta? Do you remember at all? Perhaps taken to Mdina or any of the sort of historic buildings?
Yeah, I don't think we did, because back in those days, if we were doing a tour, it would be very much, you know, here, next day to another country, and kind of like that. So you rarely get time to be a tourist.
A friend of mine who was a member of one of the support bands, the Characters, who played as your support, Gino Mikalev, he went on to play with a band called High and Dry in Germany and is now best friends with members of Iron Maiden and quite a rocker. But he remembers you and he said you dressed like Nosferatu. You had that kind of look, and that you were very interested in the history of Malta, and that he was explaining to you sort of that's a church and that's a building from the Knights, etc. So that's the impression that he got of you, that you were into Malta's history, that you were keen to learn about Malta while you were here.
Well, of course, we already did talk a little bit about history and my interest, because something that traveling the world did for me is to kind of enculturate me. Because at school, I was a horrible student. I was only interested in music and art, maybe English because I wanted to write songs, and dismissed everything else. But when I started traveling around, for instance, you mentioned Yugoslavia. When we were in Yugoslavia the first time, I remember seeing tanks. They weren't active. They were left over from some kind of war or something. But you're walking along the street and then suddenly you confront a real tank. It's a bit of a shock.
Of course.
You don't normally see that kind of thing in London, you know. Or when we went to India and you see beggars in the streets everywhere and sleeping on benches or whatever, it just completely opened my mind. It was the education that has made me the person I am today.
So we're talking to Sal Solo about the new album by Classics Nouveau, the fourth album by the band, but it's 40 years after the third. It's coming out soon. It's called Battle Cry. Sal Solo, the leader of Classics Nouveau. The story of Classics Nouveau kind of dies out in the 1983-84 period, and you go solo. And in fact, you have a hit in the UK, a top 20 hit with a song called San Damiano, which is about a place in Italy which a lot of Maltese would have visited.
Well, one of the things that happened was around that time, this new little band came along in England that was called Kajagoogoo. And it turned out that I lived in a place in London at the time called Cricklewood, and they were renting a house in Cricklewood. And so we started hanging out, and they really impressed me, because this was long before they had a record out, but they impressed me because they were very clean living. You know, they didn't take drugs, they didn't smoke. They had regular girlfriends. They didn't even drink when they were working, and they were very serious about their work in their kitchen. They had the electronic drums set up and the keyboards and everything, and so they knew they were down to business. And so I became very friendly with, in particular, Nick, who played bass.
Nick Beggs.
That's right. And so we decided to go and take a trip to Italy together, and we went to San Damiano.
For the benefit of our listeners, Limal was another famous member of Kajagoogoo, but I think he joined a bit later, and then they had their big hit Too Shy.
Yes, they were actually, beforehand, they were called Art Nouveau.
I see.
And so then they decided to get, as you said, Limal as their singer, and they became Kajagoogoo.
So you went for a trip with Nick?
Yeah, we went to this trip to Italy, to San Damiano, and I was very, very impressed. And so I wrote a song about it. And because it was a holy place, I felt that the right way to do the song was kind of with a church choir, the sound of the angels, as it were. So it wouldn't really have suited the Classics Nouveau at all. And so I decided to put it out on my own. And when it became a hit, we discussed earlier that in England at the time, everything is always moving to whatever the new thing is. So the new thing was me, and the old thing was Classics Nouveau.
Oh dear.
So overnight, they wanted me, and they didn't want Classics Nouveau. And so that's kind of what happened there, really.
I see. And your hit from the album Heart and Soul, San Damiano, was later covered by Aled Jones, the famous Welsh opera singer. So it's quite a very beautiful song.
I think he did it better than me, really. He's got a much better voice.
I think you have
A lot of
fantastic
people have
voice.
done cover versions better than me.
Now, this brings us to another band that you are associated with that people in Malta of a certain age would definitely remember, the band Rockets. Now, Rockets were, for the benefit of those who don't remember Rockets, were a sort of mix between Pink Floyd, Jean-Michel Jarre, and Giorgio Moroder. And I believe I read somewhere that you would have heard their songs, or one or two of their songs, being played at the Blitz Club by DJ Rusty Egan
Oh, yes, you're right.
in the late 70s.
Yeah, they did a sort of robotic version of On the Road Again by Canned Heat.
Yeah.
It's still their most famous song in Italy. But with the Blitz Club and all the new romantic clubs, they wanted to play electronic music, but there wasn't a whole lot of electronic music around at that time. And so it was the Human League, it was Kraftwerk, it was some Bowie. But yes, George actually, so you asked about Boy George. Yeah, I remember one time talking to him about that. He liked the Rockets. Or it might have been when I started singing with him. Maybe I was talking to him about that. And it almost predates Classics, in fact, because in that period where I was looking for quite what I was going to do with my music future after my first band had broken up, I saw an advertisement in the Melody Maker saying, Italian record company is seeking singer for established band, and
I think the company was called CGD, probably. Or
yes, CGD Records. It said something like interested parties will be brought to Italy, expenses paid. So that was what got me. I thought, I don't mind going to Italy with somebody else paying for it.
Yeah.
So I went over CGD Records,
And you were already shaving your head at the time.
Yes.
Because it turned out the band they wanted you for used to shave their head.
Well, this was the funny part, because when I arrived, and they said they had cutouts and posters everywhere of Rockets.
Because they sold 1 million in Italy, didn't they? I mean, they were very big at first.
Million and a half they sold. They were the second biggest band in Italy for many years. The biggest was called Ipu.
Ipu, that's right.
Which doesn't sound that good in English, but anyway, I guess it worked for
Yes.
Italian.
In 1980, they were the second biggest band in Italy. You're right. Do go on.
And so they'd be saying to me, of course you know the Rockets, and I'd never heard of them. And but when I saw the posters, I thought, oh, they kind of look like me, except they paint themselves silver. And so they gave me a couple of the records, and so I went home and I played. There was On the Road Again. At the time, I think the album they had at the time was called Plasteroid, and the main single was Electric Delight. I really liked that. It reminded me of, as you're a historian of music, it reminded me of the 70s Redbone song, Witch Queen of New Orleans, because it's got this, it's got this very hypnotic riff to it. And I think you kind of summed them up quite right. They're sort of Pink Floyd with Kraftwerk, except that you didn't mention the Image part, because with that part, they kind of almost Kiss and Devo.
Like Kiss, absolutely, and Devo, yeah. The same costumes, spacey, the silver paint, absolutely. And that's why I found out about you and Classics Nouveau about 10 years after I knew about Rockets. Rockets were quite big in Malta because Malta is so close to Italy. So anything that's big in Italy becomes big in Malta. And the Rockets were very well known here. And to me as a child, watching Star Trek on TV, will they be like we see on Star Trek? That's your lyric.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So something spacey like that was... to me, my imagination was fed by this amazing looking and sounding space band. And then later on, your lyrics with Classics Nouveau helped me through my teenage years and my teenage angst. But it's funny how it's funny how the two of you came together.
Well, it is because on that first visit, they offered me a contract, but I didn't take it. Mm-hmm. And then at the first gig of Classics Nouveau, as I mentioned to you, there were record companies there, and one of them was CGD. Mm-hmm. They came over to London to see us, and they made another offer, which we didn't take. But then, around the time when I went to San Damiano, because I knew CGD and they were in Milan, so I figured, we'll stop in Milan and I'll visit CGD. And so they told me that the Rockets had got so big, they really wanted to kind of branch out and try and become international, because they were all Frenchmen, and although they were singing in English, it wasn't really good enough English that you could get away with it in an English-speaking market.
Indeed.
So
The accent was problematic, and so were some of their lyrics were not written in very good English. Yes.
Right, exactly. And so they asked me if I would guest on their next album. And so I went back to that's it. Indeed, that's the one. That's the very one.
In Perception.
Yeah. And
But you had a condition, didn't you?
did I? Oh, I don't remember that. You tell me.
That you wouldn't need to spray yourself silver.
Oh, okay. I think they were planning to move away from that by that time.
Anyway.
They got fed up of doing it. And so at that time, there was a big hit in Europe. It was called Vamos a la Playa.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the guys, it was two brothers who produced that.
Rigiera.
They decided they were going to produce some Rockets for a change of direction. So I went back to Milan and recorded a few songs with them. And one of them became a hit in Italy, Under the Sun, it was called.
Great song. I mean, to me, it should have been an Italo disco hit around Europe, just like Tarzan Boy or many of some of those other Italian hits, but sung in English with the accent that became hits around the world. I think Under the Sun should have been a bigger hit.
They did a nice video for it. Of course, Italy is always very good with the cinematography, and so they had nice lighting and everything. And I ended up doing a month-long tour around Italy. And that was wonderful because every day for lunch and for dinner, we're in a beautiful Italian restaurant.
Fantastic.
And so when I went back to London after, I had to learn how to cook pasta because,
of course.
I was kind of addicted. But it was a beautiful experience. But I'll share a special story with you that I maybe have not talked about very often, was one particular city we went to. Now, the original frontman of Rockets, Christian, he decided to retire at that time and become the manager. And so we're at some city, I think it was somewhere in the south, I don't remember where exactly. And there was a big tent. There was a big tent probably for, several thousand people. And so we're backstage, and just before the show, Christian comes in and he says, "There's only 70 people in the audience. If you don't want to do it, I understand." And I said to him, well, those 70 people have paid their money just the same as if there were 70,000. And so they deserve the show. So we went out and did it. They were all sort of on the edge of the stage, and loved it. And we had to work much harder. You have to work much harder with a very small audience than with a very big audience. And so it was one of the favorite gigs I've ever done.
Oh, that's a lovely story, and it shows the dedication to fans and the people dedicated to your music that you went ahead with that. Can I just ask, when you were with Rockets during that tour, did you sing their other hits like Galactica, or was it the original singer would sing the old hits and you would sing the ones that you had written, like Contact or Under the Sun, or did you sing everything in those concerts?
I sang the whole thing. Yeah,
so you'd have to learn some of the strange songs that were probably quite strange to you, like Electric Delight and I don't know.
I always had a soft spot for Electric Delight because it was the first one of theirs that I knew. I might have changed the words a bit because it says things like Moon in June doesn't sound quite suitable for a rock song.
Yeah.
In fact, I did a total of 4 albums with Rockets at different times. And so one period, there was an album we did in Paris, and there was a new version of some of their songs on there. So there was a new version of Electric Delight.
I think 1992, Another Future. That's
yes. And so I totally rewrote the lyrics at that time.
I see.
But having said that, their biggest song apart from On the Road Again, would be Galactica.
Indeed. Did you sing that? Because I'm used to hearing
Yes.
little Gerard Lair singing
Gerard,
it.
yeah.
Gerard.
Yeah. Nice guy.
It would be interesting to hear a version of Galactica sung by you, honestly, because
Well,
that's
don't
what
say
that.
that too. Yeah,
That's
don't say that too loudly. Everything appears on YouTube all the time these days, doesn't it?
but that's one of my favorite songs from my childhood, from a time where
Well, but actually, I appreciate it a lot more now because back then, as I mentioned, in London, we were very fixated with the new thing. So anything that sounded in any way old-fashioned, then we would dismiss it. And so this sort of it sounded kind of old-fashioned Black Sabbath or something,
Indeed, yeah.
And so we would not really have been into it that much. But now, with the passage of time, where it doesn't really matter what was new, what was old, something that's just good is good. So all right now is just as good today as it was in the 70s.
Yes.
And so on. So therefore, Rockets, a lot of their stuff, it has stood the test of time. I don't know if you're aware that they do exist in some shape or form today.
I interviewed Fabrice, the last remaining original member who leads them today.
That's right. Yeah, so Fabrice has got together a bunch of younger guys, and they seem to be doing a really good job. I like their sound now. I know actually he still has the same bass player we had, Rosaire, but the rest are all new guys. And they've recently had a new singer who's way better than I am, or most of the people they've had. And so I like the new version of the Rockets. And hopefully people will like the new version of Classics Nouveau.
I'm sure they will.
Even though it is actually the same people.
This interview is about Classics Nouveau new album, Battle Cry, their first new album in 40 years, being released in 2023. But we're talking about the mid-80s and Sal Solo's association with Rockets. As you said, Rockets are still going strong today, not massively in the charts in any way, but they're an attractive live act in Italy especially, and places like Russia sometimes as well. There's even a tribute act called Universal Band that attracts quite a few people in Italy, which I went to watch, and they dress up in the original costumes and everything. Really, really good stuff.
Yeah, I've seen them. Actually, I think they went and auditioned for the X Factor or one of those shows.
I believe so.
That was funny.
Yeah. Also, another album you did with Rockets was this One Way, where the Level 42 drummer worked with you guys, I believe. It says.
Yeah, they decided at that time to come to London and do that with an English producer who I had worked with actually on my first solo album. And I always think that's a pity because that was a really good album. That One Way, it's a really good album.
This is the first album where you sung all the songs for Rockets, rather than the other one.
I heard it recently because the new Classics Nouveau album is being released on vinyl as well as CD and digital. So I had not thought of playing a record for many, many years. And so I had to buy a record player off Amazon. And so I went to my garage to see what I actually had on vinyl I could play, and I picked up that one, Rockets One Way, put it on, and thought, actually, this sounds rather good. Like, even after all those years. So, you never know why some records are a hit and some are not. That one was not.
Fantastic video for the single "Don't Give Up."
Right.
I really like it. It's really it's a great video. Very, very high production values. It's available on YouTube.
That was done in London as well, I believe, and that was very tongue-in-cheek. But really, I think that's a good album. It's well put together. It's well produced, well performed, everything. But probably the most ignored of all Rockets albums.
And then you did another Rockets album in 1992, and then your association with them kind of died away. And you've been living in the States, which brings us back to the beginning of our conversation.
I've been 24 years or so now in the States, and it is a beautiful place to live. It's very free. Everything is available. The people are really nice. And it's sort of like being on a permanent vacation for me, especially being in Florida. With the sunshine, you've got the sunshine in Malta, so you're used to that. But But for people from England, people from England get depressed because it's so grey all the time and rainy.
I lived in the UK for 2 years, so I know what you're talking about. It
And then
can be.
for 15 years, I lived in Chicago. And
Oh,
Chicago, for probably from almost September up until May, is kind of bitter cold. And there's pretty much going to be snow every year for a number of months, so that can get very depressing after a while.
indeed.
So now I'm liberated in Florida, and at this time of life, as expressed on this new album, Battle Cry, I really talk just about how great life is. The things we have to enjoy, the things that we have to look forward to. I know. When we were younger, we used to hear about people having wisdom to impart when they've lived some number of years, and now we're at that point ourselves. It's true. I mean, we're still learning all the time. I think that's the great part. There's always more to learn, and the other thing I find, a lot of my friends, because of my choir work and so on, are very young. A lot of my friends are in their 20s, and some of them 18, 19, 20, and they're so knowledgeable compared to us because of the internet learning. A lot of the stuff that I look at on YouTube, they've looked at all that stuff and more, and they talk to me about books they've read, and so I'm getting an education all the time.
So there is hope, and there is things to be cheerful about, and things to be positive about.
Well, the media, they always go for the negativity, don't they? They want to highlight the fighting. But that's just not been my experience. Even when I lived in Chicago, there's shootings every weekend on the south side of Chicago, but I never personally witnessed that. And so it's not like that's all of society. It's a very, very small part of society. Americans are generally very generous. They're very inviting. The number of times that I've been invited out to a meal at somebody's house or a restaurant or whatever, gift giving and so on, they love that. Americans really are very much as we've always thought they were. And so don't be fooled by all the publicity about all the fighting and arguing and bitching and stuff that goes on. That's a particular group of people wants to do that, but most of us do not. We enjoy life and we appreciate life. And so as many years as the good Lord has given us yet to enjoy, we plan to live life to the full.
Classics Nouveau. I believe it's from the first album, which was called Night People. The song Or a Movie, with the lyrics, "Hello, how are you today? Why not come and see a play or a movie?" And that sounds very much, the feel of that song reminds me very much of Bedsitter by Soft Cell, which came out around the same time. And a Maltese singer did a version of it a few years ago, Bedsitter as well, Ira Losco. They're very similar. Perhaps you were going through a low period as a youth, living in a bedsit yourself. You wrote those lyrics. Many years later, when I discovered that song, and I was a teenager myself, and you're still trying to find out who you are and find your own place in the world, that song really helped me. Number one, it made me think I'm not the only one to feel lonely sometimes, to feel abandoned. But then it also helped me say, listen, perhaps I should pick up the phone and invite someone to go to a movie. And it worked on two levels. So I'd like to thank you very much for those lyrics.
But well, I'm glad to hear that. Yes, I'm glad to hear that. BP says that's one of his favorite songs that I've written, because that was apparently one of my demos when I first met X-Ray Specs. So I had written that much long before Classics, and you're quite right. I was living in a bedsit. And so I'm only 20-something years old in my one room. And even actually when Classics first started to succeed, I was still living in a bedsit because it took the royalties from Is It a Dream before I had enough money to buy my own place. Nice. And so it does very much speak of that sort of young experience when you don't have a lot of money, and you don't really know your direction in life. You don't know what your future is. And so you kind of just don't know what to do with yourself. I think a lot of the songs probably in those early times are like that. You mentioned earlier inside, outside, having a negative thing about the world. And one time I recall a journalist said to me, you say nothing much to look forward to. Is that really what you think? And I said, well, that's what my generation thinks. And so I'm voicing my generation, really.
The Sex Pistols, no future. There was that kind of attitude at the time. Yeah. But okay, so will there be lyrics like that on the new album? I mean, we've heard one song so far. It's all very positive.
So, well, certainly not the negative, really.
Okay.
I've tried to be more poetic. There's a lot of imagery which is in there. And I think that, again, it's because we're more mature, our audience is more mature, and so we require a little bit more. So there's a touch of me sort of trying my best Bob Dylan to really be poetic. And mostly just the reflections for our generation. And so some of the songs, I mean, there is a little bit of negative in that one song. I remember BP said to me one day, he said, I don't usually listen to lyrics, but I decided to listen to lyrics today. He said, oh, they're really good, but this particular song, he said, is very depressing. Now, to me, it's not, but he interpreted it that way. And so a lot of times, you'll have to ask me this after you hear the album, because a lot of times, you know, it's better to just let people interpret them their way.
Once you've let it out, it becomes other people's, doesn't it? It doesn't remain almost yours anymore. It's how we interpret it.
Yes, it's better for every individual to take ownership, really. I mean, one last little thing to mention in that vein is that the artwork for this album, Battle Cry, is from the same artist we had at the beginning, and Carolyn Calbera, her name is. And we didn't realize the fans are so kind of attached to those early images because, again, it was the start of a movement. And it's so I suppose in the same way that maybe people from the 60s actually, as you showed me that picture, I've got to tell you another story before I go, because that photo session that we had for the first album, Night People, when we went into the session, one of my heroes was sitting in there, had just finished his session. That was Roy Wood. And Roy Wood is known for Wizard. And before that, the Move. And it was just a big shock to me, because I just remember as a child, like watching them on Top of the Pops and all that, and thinking it was the greatest thing. And so I don't think I had much to say to him, really, but it was just a great meeting that I'm always kind of proud of. I met Roy Wood at my first photo session.
And a very interesting coincidence, the drummer for Wizard was Maltese.
Oh, there we go. Maltese gets in everywhere, doesn't it?
Charlie Grima, yeah. Anyway, do go on, sorry. Yeah.
Great. I think I've finished the story, haven't I?
Okay. I just wanted to conclude by asking, new album, Classics Nouveau, 40 years after your third album, the fourth album, Battle Cry, Classics Nouveau. So you have a new album, so you're going to tour again, and you're going to come back to Malta, yes?
Well, the question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And so if you were a band that was geared up to touring, you would tour to promote a record. But if you're a band that has not toured for 40 years, then you have to wait and see, does the record provide an audience that actually wants to see a tour? So that's where we are at this moment.
So maybe yes, maybe no. We'll leave it hanging. I mean, exactly. We've just had Robbie Williams to give a big concert here. You know, it would be good to follow up Robbie Williams with a concert by Classics Nouveau. In 1982, we didn't have that many big bands come to Malta. It was quite a rare thing. So Classics Nouveau was a big thing. Now it's much more common. But it would be great to see you play live again. And it's been a great honor to talk to you. And thank you so much for your time. Sal Solo of Classics Nouveau.
Thank you, Colin. I hope to speak with you again one day.